Good afternoon and welcome to our Missouri Prairie Foundation webinar, Missouri's Prairie Orchids with Steve Buback. My name is Erica Van Franken. I'm the Special Projects Coordinator for the Foundation, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this webinar today. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section on your screen, and at the end, the Foundation's Executive Director, Carol David, will read those out to Steve. This webinar is being recorded and the link will be shared with all of you tomorrow, along with resources mentioned during the presentation and Q&A session. Steve Buback is a natural history biologist with the Missouri Department of Conservation, a position he has held for 11 years. Prior to this, he earned a bachelor's degree at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, a master's from Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, and worked for Forest Park Forever in St. Louis, Missouri. He has a particular fondness for rare plants, insects, and ecosystems. And now I will turn it over to Steve.
All right, thank you. And thanks everybody for joining us on this nice afternoon. Hopefully people have gotten out and got to see some of these orchids we're discussing today. So I was asked to talk about prairie orchids of Missouri. So as people who are familiar with prairies and people who are familiar with plants, and especially orchids know, this could potentially be a huge topic. If we just talked about prairie plants, this would take far longer than the hour allotted. And if we just talked about the orchids in Missouri, this would also be a huge undertaking. Narrowing it down to the prairie orchids, thankfully, makes it somewhat manageable. And hopefully we'll share some good information today. And at the very least, hopefully have some pretty pictures. I'm going to do my best to cover all the orchids that occur in the prairies of the state. But I will spend a lot more time on two species in particular, the Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid and the Western Prairie Fringed Orchid. These are both federally threatened species that I had the good fortune to be the recovery lead for over a decade. So I'm most familiar with these species, and that's what you'll be hearing most about today. Hopefully that doesn't bother anybody too much. So let's talk a little bit about orchids in general. Orchids are a hyper diverse family. By some estimates, most estimates, they're the most diverse family of flowering plants. They are monocots, which makes them separate from most of the trees and wildflowers that we see on the prairie, and actually more related to grasses, sedges, and other less showy species. Monocots refer to the seed leaves that come up. So a monocot has one seed leaf that comes up. Most of our species are dicots. Familiar wildflowers. But orchids are extremely diverse. Estimates range from 22,000 to 35,000 in over 800 genera in the world. Narrowing it down to North America helps a little bit. We're down to 701 species and 208 genera. That's still an awful lot to cover. Missouri has a good diversity of orchids, 27 species and 17 different genera. However, a lot of these occur in the Ozarks and wooded environments and fens, and acidic seeps and other places that we don't get to talk about today. So orchids are most diverse in the tropics. Indeed, when we think of orchids in pop culture or just from our familiarity, a lot of us might think of, species growing off of limbs of trees or, growing in a swamp somewhere that's dark and steamy and hot all the time. And our prairies can certainly be hot and steamy, but they're characterized by full sun. And that serves to eliminate, quite a bit of the orchid diversity that normally could occur. But the orchids that do occur in the prairies are especially adapted for that. Whenever I talk about orchids in general, I think of a lineage that has made a lot of extremely specific evolutionary choices over the course of its existence. So orchids are hyper diverse because they have a lot of interesting stories to tell. They have a lot of background. They have a lot of adaptations and specializations that make them uniquely adapted to their niche in the environment. Unfortunately, in a heavily modified environment like prairies, or like pretty much any ecosystem in Missouri today, those choices sometimes have led them to being extremely rare. We really don't know how common or uncommon most of these orchids were prior to European settlement, but it's safe to say that since we've lost 99% of our tallgrass prairie in the state of Missouri, we've also lost quite a bit of orchids in terms of abundances, but also maybe in diversity as well. So orchids are highly specialized to talk about this, and it starts at the beginning. We'll discuss the life history of the orchid a little bit. So what you're looking at here are orchid seeds on your far left, stage 0. Orchids, unlike many of our plants, don't provision their seeds. So when you think of something like a oak tree that comes with a big fat acorn, that's one seed, and most of the weight there is not the endosperm waiting to germinate and grow into the tree. It's nutrients that are provisioned for that seedling. And so when an oak tree germinates, it has a ready source of carbohydrates and other nutrients available in order to which make a plant. Orchid seeds went a completely different route. Orchid seeds are tiny, usually as small as dust. You can see the scale of 1 millimeter there, and see the actual seed is maybe 1/3 of a millimeter, maybe smaller. And almost all of our orchids are this way. So their seeds are wind dispersed, and the orchid releases them, hoping it lands in a spot that's right. And how does the orchid seed know that it's the right spot? Well, it's a combination of soil characteristics. Most of our orchids are restricted to soil types. And then most of our orchids that we have been studied also require the presence of mycorrhizal fungi. So what you can see in stage 1 here is the very early root shoots sending out from that orchid seed. So it sends out very tiny little roots. Stage 2, at the very top here, you can see the beginning of the leaf coming out. And then in stage 3, you can see what that leaf is going to look like. And this process can take an awfully long time. For the prairie fringed orchids, the eastern and the western, again, because they're well studied, they're federally threatened plants. So we have received money to actually figure these things out. Most of our orchid species, the exact processes here are unknown. So we're going to assume for the purposes of this talk, they're different. However, they could vary widely. So in stage 3, you can see that first leaf coming out. When an eastern or western prairie fringed orchid is sending up its first leaf, it can take up to a year or 2 for that leaf to emerge. And it'll exist as just a single leaf emerging above the soil for several years after that. So it's a very slow process. We'll talk a little bit more about how that goes. But it's important to realize that these seeds are not equipped to survive in the wild on their own. And as adult plants, these plants are not equipped to survive in the wild on their own. This is a root stock of a eastern prairie fringed orchid that we dug up for a project that we'll talk about a little later. This is the complete roots. We think of roots as having, a lot of fine tendrils to reach through the soil, to transport water and carbohydrates up to the plant, and water and nutrients to the plant, and store carbohydrates. Well, orchids don't have this ability on their own. They just have these thick, fleshy roots. They're surprisingly easy to dig up. This plant, when it was dug up, had 1 leaf to it. And this plant was not dug up in vain. So they're characterized by these symbioses, these mycorrhizal associates. So for an orchid seed, for one of our Plantanthera species at least, but for probably most orchid seeds to germinate, it needs to be infected by a mycorrhizal fungi. The fungi that the prairie fringed orchid associates with is called a Ceratobaiza microfungus. So when it infects the seed, it then takes things out of the soil. It takes micronutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus from the soil, transports it into the plant. And in return, mycorrhizal fungi gets sugar that's produced through photosynthesis. Now, what the mycorrhiza gets from the orchid seed after germination is not really clear, but reliably, that orchid seeds, for an orchid to grow, it has to be infected by a certain mycorrhizal fungal at just the right time. And that adult plant that I showed you earlier, we get essentially all of its macronutrients, its phosphorus and nitrogen, and its micronutrients from the mycorrhizal partners. It's even thought that the adult plants have to partner with different species of mycorrhizal fungi than the seedlings in order to get all the nutrients that they need. So these mycorrhizal fungi actually invade the roots. You can see a diagram of it here on the lower right. They enter into the roots in a commiserate relationship, and the fungi probably gets as much out of this relationship as the plant. It's important to note when we talk about these fungi, you may be thinking of some things like oyster mushrooms or some of our familiar mushroom species, but a lot of these species don't have visible presence above ground very often. So they're likely not a lot of the fungi that we're familiar with that we may see while on a walk through the prairie or through the woods. Instead, they spend the vast majority of their lives just interacting with these plants underground in a relationship that's largely hidden. A lot of this work is still ongoing in terms of science, in terms of the research. So there's still a lot we're learning about mycorrhizal associates, particularly what they get from the plants in exchange for what they provide. And the relationships are often extremely complex and hard to unravel. There's also a lot of soil bacteria that interact with these fungi, and high levels of the wrong soil bacteria can severely suppress your mycorrhizal fungi. So the fungi are subject to all the same environmental drivers that that the orchids are. And so when we manage for orchids, we're also trying to manage for mycorrhizal fungi. Unfortunately, we don't yet know how to do that very well. And so once an orchid, the seed finds the right place to germinate. Once it gets infected by the right mycorrhizal fungi, once it manages to survive as a tiny leaf in the middle of the prairie, often a prairie that's orders of magnitude taller than this leaf, it might decide to flower. For the prairie fringed orchid seen here, that can take up to 7 years. And orchids are another unique adaptation of an orchid is the presence of pollinia. So on this prairie fringed orchid, you can see a couple pollinia that have been deposited here. And then your pollinia were actually stored here. So orchids utilize a unique system where they package all their pollen together in no pollinia. And then at the bottom here, you see what we call a visidia. And so that visidia is a sticky pad. And when an insect visitor would come to visit this flower, that visidia would stick the pollinia onto the insect visitor, thus allowing it to be transported to another plant. So most plants would just release individual pollen and it would stick to the hair of a bee or a moth or whoever was the visitor. Orchids have opted for this mass transport strategy. And we'll see some pictures and talk about this later about how this is good and potentially causing some problems. So in this prairie fringed orchid, this is actually, these pollinia were deposited right on the receptacle. So this prairie fringed orchid would potentially produce seed next year. This hole you're seeing down below is a nectar spur. It's kind of or not obvious as to what exactly we're looking at here. Now I seem to have broken my PowerPoint. Hopefully everybody's still with me here. All right. So in order for those pollinia to be transported, they need to be visited by the proper pollinator. And every orchid has kind of evolved different strategies to attract pollinators and to deal with pollinators. But orchids are notorious for being deceptive in their pollinator attraction. One of the best examples of that is on this Cypripedium candidum. All Cypripediums are deceptive. They don't offer very good nectar or pollen rewards to pollinators, but they look like they do. So they attract a pollinator in just based on the size and shape of the flower. And then the pollinator would fall into the bowl of the Cypripedium. And the only way out is to call through a tube at the back of the flower. And the back of the flower is actually where the pollinia would be located. The bee would climb out, get the pollinia attached to it, and then have to fly off to another Cypripedium to get fooled again, where it would then deposit the pollinia. On the left here, you see a different type of orchid that actually relies on mosquitoes for pollination. It doesn't have as much deception as some of the others. The prairie fringed orchid, the Platantheras, do offer a nectar reward in the spur that you can't see here. And they're primarily pollinated by hawk moths. Many of our other orchids we're going to discuss today rely on bees, which are some of the more familiar pollinators. I do want to point out the crab spider sitting on top of the prairie fringed orchid here with the pollinia attached to its leg. So one disadvantage to the use of Paullinia, we looked at the prairie fringed orchid already, is that they really only have two. And so if those get accidentally dislodged, or if a crab spider manages to walk in there and encounter a Paullinia, that's half of its reproductive potential, that it gets lost in one fell swoop. The advantage of producing pollen in single grains is that you can lose a few of those and you're not out a lot of energy. If you lose that entire Paullinia, you lose a lot. However, if that Paullinia does manage to make it to another prairie fringed orchid, then you have a lot of pollen in place. And as a result, orchids produce a lot of seeds. Because they're dust sized, a capsule of Cypripedium may contain 6,000 different seeds in it. Prairie fringed orchids are more like 1,000 or 2,000, but the seeds they don't have a lot of energy in them again. So the seeds are very low investment for a seed, and they compensate by producing them in mass quantities. I think I messed everything up by annotating. I apologize.
Steve, do you want us to try to pull up our copy of it? And then you can just tell us when to advance the slides?
Yeah, let me try one more time. I'm not sure why this is happening, but so we talked a little bit about habitat loss, and that has probably been the biggest threat. Sorry, is that showing? Check.
No, we don't see your screen.
Okay, it says it's showing now.
Yes, we see it.
Okay, so habitat loss historically has been one of the biggest threats to orchid populations, and certainly that is true on the prairies, where we've lost 99% of our prairie. The prairie orchids that we have that remain are subject to a host of other threats, many of which are out of our control. So our orchid populations kind of boom and bust because they tend to be longer lived. They're not annuals, they're not biennials, they tend to be perennials. So things like drought often have a drastic effect upon our orchid populations. The prairie fringed orchid you see on the left here has aborted most of its buds because of an incipient drought. And the few that remain that are still green may or may not decide to bloom. As a long-lived plant, this may not be the end of the plant. If it aborts its buds, it's basically going to save that energy for next year. Over the course of monitoring prairie fringed orchids, we have tagged these individual plants, and we'll see plants that have senesced early, such as this one, that then will come back next year and still manage to bloom and hopefully reproduce for the year after. Orchids don't have a ton of invertebrates that feed on them. This torticid moth tucked in the inflorescence on your right with a webbing hanging off it is one of the few caterpillars that I've ever observed feeding on an orchid species. They are still subject to herbivory by mammals, white-tailed deer, and cattle will certainly graze on orchids in the right circumstances. But conversion and habitat loss, prairie conversion and habitat loss are still probably the biggest factors of orchid populations within the state. So now we understand a little bit more about orchids, who they are. So let's talk about the orchids that survive in the habitats that the Missouri Prairie Foundation is working hard to preserve, the orchids of the prairie. So I came up with about 9 different orchid species that we're likely to see in prairies. Some of these are more common, some of these are less common. Many of these have already bloomed, but if you haven't been out to see orchids on the prairie yet, your chances are not lost. Certainly some of the Spiranthes still have yet to bloom, and the prairie fringed orchids are just starting to come online. And we were talking before the talk that the grass pink orchids are still in full bloom, so you haven't missed your chance to see a lot of these. So we'll start with the Oklahoma grass pink orchid. Those of you that follow orchid taxonomy, I'm sure there's dozens of you on the talk, will know that this orchid species is fairly newly described to science. It was once called Calopogon tuberosus. Was thought to be the same as the orchid that grows in fens in southeast Missouri, but they recently decided that this is its own separate entity. And in Missouri, this map is a little bit wrong. I don't have authority to change it. It's from the Flora of Missouri project, but all those spots in western Missouri are the Oklahoma grass pink orchid. So the grass pink orchids, this species is actually ranked a G2. So it's considered vulnerable or imperiled throughout the country, wherever it occurs. And it only occurs in prairies. In contrast to Calopogon tuberosus, it occurs in dry prairies and upland sites. And so it can be found all the way, or historically was found from Texas to Minnesota. A lot of the northern populations are thought to be extirpated, are thought to be gone from those habitats. But in Missouri, this species is still relatively common. You can go out to a prairie and find hundreds of them if you manage to time it right. One thing we were talking about before is that the pictures of it, we always like to get up close for these pictures and show off the wonderful flowers. But, it's a short species. It seldom grows more than, I'd say 8-10 inches with 3 or 4 or 5 flowers on it. What I want to point out about this flower is that we talked about the specialized pollination structures that it has. And one interesting thing, I'm not going to annotate this because I think that messed it up last time. But on most flowers, if you were to look at these yellow structures in the center of the flower, one would assume those are the pollen for the flower. And in this case, you'd be terribly wrong. So in what looks like an upside down flower with the pollen up top and the reproductive structures down here, what's actually going on is that Calopogon has these pseudosamina that lure pollinators in. There's no pollen on this flower. It doesn't produce any sort of reward for a pollinator, but it attracts pollinators in with these things that look like pollen. The bee visits, and if it's a heavy bee, like a bumblebee or one of our larger Andrena species, it actually will tip that lip down, and then it falls onto this lower structure backwards. And the plenia are at the bottom of the tip of this arrow-shaped structure here. And so the plenia are deposited on the back of the bee. Presumably, the bee does not learn its lesson, and then it flies off to visit another grass pink orchid where the exact same thing happens over again. Tries to get onto those fake plenia, tips over backwards, and deposits the old plenia onto the new plant, and maybe get some new ones deposited in its place. Now, I want you to just pause for a second and think about the amount of evolutionary time it must have taken for this species to not only to decide not to go the traditional route of attracting a bee in with pollen and getting pollen spread that way, but to put its pollen into plenia and then put those on this structure that the bee has to tip over backwards in order to contact. It's a much more complicated process than the usual straightforward pollen visitation, but it appears to be working for the Calopogon, and they're holding on strong in Missouri at least. Surprisingly, there's not a lot of known about this orchid, despite its wide range. It is, again, relatively new to science. And so anybody who's looking for research topics or plants to study, this would be a great one to look at. The pollinators of it have not been very well studied, and a lot of its life history information is still unknown. So now we're going to get into some of the biggest and most beautiful orchids in the state, in my subjective opinion, the prairie fringed orchids. So we'll start with the eastern prairie fringed orchid. This species has long been thought to be extirpated from the state. There were historic records from down in southeast Missouri, the edge of a fen, and then up in Rawls County along the Salt River in a marsh along the Salt River. Both of those sites were destroyed over time or lost to just hydrological changes. And so we thought this species was extirpated until about 2009, when my predecessor as natural history biologist in Northwest Missouri, Tom Nagel, rediscovered it on a very small cemetery prairie, less than half acre in size. And so all of the work that all the information we're going to present from here on is thanks to his serendipitous discovery in a small out of the way prairie remnant. And it goes to show that visiting prairies, no matter how small or apparently degraded, can still be fruitful. You never know when you might find the next population of eastern prairie fringed orchid. And I hope you do. Let me know. So the prairie fringed orchid is currently listed as federally threatened. It ranges from Missouri in the southwest all the way up to one extant site in Maine. Most of the population is currently found in Michigan and Illinois. They currently have, I believe, 30 or 40 populations that are doing relatively well. It should be flowering probably next week, maybe the week after, with a slow spring we're having. And as I mentioned, it's currently only known from essentially one site on private property. This species as well is ranked as G2, so it's relatively uncommon and imperiled throughout the country. And in the state, it's S1, so it's considered critically endangered. Again, only one site. So it starts its life, as a leaf. This curled leaf that we show you here with a wedding ring around it, kind of show you for scale, is an individual that will probably attempt to flower this year. So these leaves will emerge in late April and try to compete with the surrounding vegetation and gather up as much light as it can in order to fuel its blooming and seed producing process. How it makes these decisions is unknown, but when they do decide to bloom, they often bloom in mass. So we believe that populations are strongly tied with rainfall. So for seedlings to establish, a lot of times you're talking rainfall in September. And then for populations to bloom, we tend to look at rainfall levels in April or May in order to provide sufficient moisture. The site that this species occurs on is a small hardpan prairie, but the bulk of the population we have come to discover in later years is found in an adjacent swale, basically across a county road from the cemetery prairie. And the population in that swale, which tends to be a little bit wetter, can often number in the hundreds. So in early spring, in April, late April, we'll go out and survey for these, try to get an idea of when this eastern prairie fringed orchid might bloom and what our populations might look like for the year. So I mentioned that the eastern prairie fringed orchids are hawk moth pollinated, and I wanted to give you guys an idea of what it looks like. So this is Sphinx erymetreus with plenia attached. This Sphinx moth has visited dozens and dozens of eastern prairie fringed orchid. Each prairie fringed orchid only produces 2 plenia. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, it's probably visited 20 different flowers and hopefully deposited some of these plenia along the way. And here's what an eastern prairie fringed orchid looks like by August. So the flowering period on these only lasts a week or two. It's very brief, and it has to be absolutely timed right with the Sphinx moth population. So Sphinx moths are long distance dispersers. They probably were not raised on the prairies in which they're doing the pollination services. Many Sphinx moths will fly hundreds of miles over the course of their lives. So when you imagine a Sphinx moth trying to find a prairie fringed orchid, it seems almost hopeless. This moth flying hundreds of miles to find a half-acre prairie nestled in the middle of an agricultural landscape, and then manage to visit enough prairie fringed orchids in order to distribute those plenia from plant to plant, and it starts to seem like a really hard sell. So over the course of the 12 years now that we've been monitoring prairie fringed orchids, this is what our populations tend to look like. Populations were highest immediately after discovery. That's probably part of the reason why we discovered them in the first place, is because there was 150 blooming plants. Some years we make a concentrated effort to monitor vegetative plants, but I showed you the size of those vegetative plants, and you can imagine trying to avoid stepping on those in the prairie, and it's really difficult. So in years when populations are low, we may find more vegetative plants, but in a normal year, like last year, where we're seeing 60, 70 flowering plants, the vegetative plants are probably grossly undersurveyed. So I mentioned before that drought is one of the major drivers of these prairie fringed orchid populations. And you can see that 2011 was a major drought year for us in Northwest Missouri, and 2017 going into 2018 was another major drought year. And so our populations really seem to be driven by those cycles. They really crash in a drought year, and then it takes them time to rebuild. We don't know what would happen to these populations in the face of a persistent drought, one that would last 4 or 5 years. These are long-lived species, so we're hopeful that they would persist, but we really just don't know. So one thing I do want to mention here, and I don't have any pictures from the project, is that because of the seeming rarity of this species and the fact that it's only found on one site currently and on private property, in the summer of 2021, we entered into a partnership with the Missouri Botanical Garden to try to grow this species in the laboratory, which is notoriously difficult. So they came out last summer and moved Plenia between a couple plants to ensure good seed set, and then came back in August and collected those seeds, and then have been attempting to grow them. So the first attempt they took was to do something called that they're calling green pod culture, and it's to take immature seeds and try to grow them in a petri dish. They didn't have much luck with this, although I'm told that many orchid species respond well to green pod culture. So currently our seeds are sitting in a petri dish where they've been inoculated with the Ceratoryza mycorrhizal associate that we know from the wild. They actually took the fungus from the roots that I showed you earlier and used that very same fungus, the identical mycelia, put them in the petri dish with the seedlings so they could get it inoculated. And by 2024, we should know whether or not we'll have little tiny eastern prairie fringed orchid babies in order to hopefully establish a population on an area that's not only more secure, but also maybe has a little bit more acreage for these plants to move around on in case of drought or extremely wet years, or not get extirpated by an ill-timed fire. So eastern prairie fringed orchid is a relatively new species to science again. It was pretty recently described, and it was segregated out from the western prairie fringed orchid, Platanthera praeclara. So the western prairie fringed orchid is a smaller plant than the eastern prairie fringed orchid, but it tends to have bigger flowers. One other notable character that separates it is the location of the plenia on the plant. So the western prairie fringed orchid has the Visidia spread out, and on the eastern prairie fringed orchid, they're narrow, closer together. So as you look down the throat of this western prairie fringed orchid, you can kind of see where the plenia are located, or at least should be located. The very top flower still has its plenia. So in the western prairie fringed orchid, it actually deposits its plenia directly upon the eyes of the pollinator. And on the eastern prairie fringed orchid, it tends to put them in between the eyes of the pollinator. These species also have a different nectar tube length. So the nectar is contained at the very bottom. You can see these really long spurs coming off the backs of the flower, and the nectar is contained at the very bottom. And that's to keep bees, most moths from visiting these flowers. Hawk moths have very long mouth parts for drinking exclusively nectar from these types of flowers. And in fact, there's a very famous story of Charles Darwin, who was saw an orchid in Madagascar that had a nectar spur that was 30 centimeters long or something just amazingly ridiculous. And he hypothesized at the time that there must be a hawk moth out there with a proboscis long enough to reach the bottom of that nectar tube. And everybody kind of laughed at him. And it took over 100 years for scientists to find that hawk moth that had the mouth parts that were the right length to get to nectar spur, and therefore was the pollinator for that orchid. So each of these prairie fringed orchid species has 2 or 3 species of hawk moths that have the right proboscis length to reach to the bottom. If a hawk moth tries to visit these prairie fringed orchids and doesn't have a long enough tongue, it's not going to get any reward. So it's not going to keep visiting prairie fringed orchids. But it's too long of a proboscis, it's going to reach the nectar, but it's not going to get the plumia stuck to its head. So it's not going to be an effective pollinator. So these things are really in kind of a Goldilocks situation, that it has to be just the right hawk moth at just the right time. Historically, the western prairie fringed orchid has been found in the western part of the state. Unfortunately, all of our populations south of the Missouri River have been lost. We don't know of any populations right now that aren't in Northwest Missouri, so we only know them from Holt, Atchison, and Harrison counties. And unlike the eastern prairie fringed orchid, all these populations, we're fortunate enough to have them on public property. So they're well protected and managed. I'm not going to say that the populations are booming as a result. One good story I want to tell about the protection of these guys is that one of the western prairie fringed orchid sites only exists because the farmer that owned the site would go and pick a bouquet of prairie fringed orchid sites, of prairie fringed orchid flowers for his wife every year when they were blooming. He had no idea what the flower was. He, didn't preserve the prairie, didn't not plow it for any other reason that his wife loved the flowers and he wanted to bring her a bouquet of them every summer. So we have that farmer's wife to thank for one of our 3 populations of the western prairie fringed orchid. So this is a vegetative leaf of the western prairie fringed orchid. As I mentioned earlier, because of its long life cycle, it'll often persist as this vegetative leaf for 3, 5, 7 years before it ever decides to flower. These are extremely hard to survey. Finding new populations of the western prairie fringed orchid where it's not going to bloom is next to impossible unless you stumble across one of these things serendipitously. So a lot of the work that's been done on both the eastern and western prairie fringed orchid was done by a good friend of mine, Dave Ashley. He was a professor at Missouri Western College and Missouri Western University in St. Joseph. And he was actually a parasitologist by training and just kind of got talked into working on prairie fringed orchid and has done over 30 years of monitoring on this species. So a lot of what we know is really thanks to his hard work. And I want to give credit where credit is due. So all of our orchids on these prairies are monitored. This is a GPS unit, a Trimble GPS unit, which provides centimeter level accuracy. So we have tracked these things over time, not only population level, but the exact locations of these prairie fringed orchids. So we have a really good idea about how long they live. The idea we have about how long it takes them to flower is due to a lot of this work. And recently, we marked these with nails in the ground and a metal tag for long-term tracking. And recently we're starting to discover that these orchids, they were originally thought to die after about 7 years after their first bloom. But we're starting to find that these orchids may rebloom, that they may be able to go back underground in dormancy for several years and then reemerge. So this is a blacklight trap that we've placed out over the prairie fringed orchids. This is how we trap the hawk moth pollinators. This is how we learned who we need to be managing for in order to manage for prairie fringed orchids. You can just see the orchid peeking through at the bottom. We leave these up overnight and come back and check them in the morning. We've also used dye tracing where we'll paint fluorescent powder onto the prairie fringed orchid flowers, and then the hawk moth visitors will get this on their heads and then visit other flowers. So we can kind of guess how many flowers on average they were visiting. And it turns out it's not very many. It's only 3 or 4 flowers that each hawk moth was visiting. We were hoping, it'd be something more like 20 in order to assure adequate pollination. So our populations of western prairie fringed orchid have declined substantially over time. Prior to MDC acquisition, all of our sites were managed by haying. Upon acquisition, we ceased the haying and started to implement a burn regime. We acquired the site around 1999 when we had about 250 prairie fringed orchids. And you can see that our populations have gone up and down over time, but they've never approached the levels that they were prior to acquisition. We don't know at this point if that means that fire is bad for the orchids. We don't know if the populations we were seeing in the 90s were sustainable. That mass flowering may have been a reaction by the orchids to to being hayed. Haying often occurred in mid-June, and it was not uncommon to see prairie fringed orchids in the hay bales. So it may have just been desperation on the part of the orchids trying to get some seeds off, because in previous years they hadn't, trying to maintain the populations. Those questions are unanswerable at this point. So I'm going to go more quickly through the rest of these because I'm spending a lot of time on them. One of the most common Platanthera species is the raggedy fringed orchid. You can see the flowers are not nearly as showy. They don't stand out to the same degree as the prairie fringed orchids. This plant is mostly thought to be pollinated by mosquitoes, some other flies that would visit, and it's wide ranging throughout the state. And it's not restricted to prairies. You'll find it in open woodlands and in glade situations, but it does occur on prairies, sometimes in large numbers. This is probably the weediest, or one of the weedier of our orchid species. It's not necessarily tied to high quality habitats, but it does occur on prairies. And honestly, it's probably the most common orchid you'll find on most of our prairies. So now we're going to move into a different genus of orchids, the Spiranthes. Spiranthes can be quite beautiful, and I've learned new things in putting together this talk, and I'm going to share some of them with you today. One of the most important or interesting things that I've found out is that one of the species that we thought was our prairie species, Spiranthes cernua, we thought it occurred in prairies and woodlands, has now been renamed as Spiranthes incurva. It blooms earlier than some of our other Spiranthes species, especially some of the ones you're likely to confuse it with, mostly on acidic substrates, making our sandstone prairies of Southwest Missouri a great habitat for it. Spiranthes cernua is one of the bigger of one of the showier of the Spiranthes, one of the lady tresses orchids. They're so named ladies tresses in reference to the shape of the inflorescence here. So this range map kind of shows you the new range of Spiranthes incurva, showing that it encompasses most of what was historically prairie, not only in Missouri, but throughout most of its range, kind of probably extended up through the Prairie Peninsula. What we have traditionally referred to as Spiranthes cernua is definitely more of a southeastern species, and in Missouri, probably restricted to the Ozarks. So Spiranthes incurva mostly looks like Great Plains ladies tresses, which we'll discuss in a minute. The flowers are white versus ivory. It blooms just about a week earlier. It'll be in full bloom when Great Plains ladies tresses, Magna Camporum, is just starting. And its lateral sepals are intermediate. We'll talk about that hopefully in a second here. So Spiranthes bloom from the bottom up. It's protandrous, and bumblebees and leafcutter bees are the major pollinators. And they have a very traditional pollination system. They don't have any special tricks that may prevent them from getting pollinated effectively. So Spiranthes magna camporum, in opposition to cernua, prefers calcareous substrates. So it should be looked for on dolomite prairies, on limestone prairies, and it does occur on the Luss Hill prairies of Northwest Missouri in Holt-Ashton County. Those haven't been updated in this range map. So this species is not commonly found on prairies, but it should be out there. One of the best characters for this species is its fragrance. So a lot of these Spiranthes don't have a strong smell to them, but this one is variously described as smelling of fresh cut hay, of almonds, and I've heard one person refer to it as apples. But the chemical responsible for that is coumarin, and it's the only species that really has a strong odor. It's also relatively tall and showy for a Spiranthes. So if you encounter a very fragrant Spiranthes that has these characteristic bullhorn lateral sepals on the sides of what appears to be the main flower, a lot of times those are arched upwards. I'm not actually convinced this is Magna Camporum, but perhaps incurva, the newly described species. But take a look, and more importantly, take a smell for yourself. And you may start to document Great Plains ladies tresses on the prairies of Missouri. So far more common on our prairies is slender lady tresses, Spiranthes lacera. This one, as you can see by the range map, is not restricted to prairies, but is found throughout the Ozarks. It's one of the easier Spiranthes to tell because if you look down the throat of this flower here, you can see that green spot, and that is characteristic of the species. Spiranthes lacera is not restricted to prairies. It can be found in old field settings or roadsides. It's probably the weediest of our orchids, but nonetheless, it's a treat to have an orchid growing in any habitat you might find it whether it's prairie or not. Spiranthes tuberosa is restricted to acidic substrates. You can see that the flowers are all white inside, which will help you differentiate it from the last species we talked about. It's also much smaller. This is probably the daintiest of our Spiranthes, but it should be looked for on the sandstone prairies of Southwest Missouri, where it can be relatively common. And then Spiranthes vernalis will be the last species we'll cover. Spiranthes vernalis is the tallest of our Spiranthes species, and I apologize I didn't have a great photo of this, but these will often be 3 feet tall. The majority of our species would probably max out around a foot, maybe 14 inches. Spiranthes vernalis is also the earliest blooming of our Spiranthes species. This picture here was taken in June, and it often begins to bloom in June. So it's fairly distinct, and you should be able to find it any day now. So the Spiranthes species, like Calopogon, are relatively understudied. Not much is known about their mycorrhizal associates or many of their pollinators. So there's still a lot to be learned about the prairie orchids of Missouri. Today, I've given you just a brief overview, even though it was 50 minutes long. And want to hope that you've got some motivation to go out there and look for these guys for yourself, but also that there's still a lot to be learned about the orchids that occur on our prairies. They have special adaptations to survive these xeric environments compared to a lot of their terrestrial cousins, and a lot of adaptations probably that we still don't know about. So thank you for coming today, and hopefully we'll have time for a few questions.
Thank you, Steve. That was wonderful. I'm Carol David, Executive Director of the Prairie Foundation, and we do have a number of questions. Can you hear me okay, Steve?
I can.
When you were talking about the mycorrhizal fungi, was there a particular kind of mycorrhizal fungi that you spoke of? There was a question, and I wasn't sure if I had, if there was something very specific that you had mentioned.
Yeah, so they do have very specific partners, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on their partners. But the Ceratophrygma, I believe, is the species that needs to infect the seeds of the prairie fringed orchids, the eastern and western, in order for it to germinate. And, as far as I know, that's all of our understanding of it. Probably each of these orchid species could have different partners on different substrates. The fungi that the prairie fringed orchids rely on is relatively widespread in prairie environments. So we don't believe it's going to be a limiting factor for new populations to get established. But again, we're still learning.
Thank you. There are a couple questions about if any of the prairie orchids are being propagated, for example, in the prairie planting in Forest Park and at Shaw Nature Reserve. And I was wondering if you knew if any were being propagated and reintroduced in not in gardens, but in native habitats.
Right. So, I'm not aware of any being introduced at Forest Park or Shaw, but it's been over a decade since I've been familiar with those sites. I know that further north in Illinois, they're doing a lot of propagation work with the federally threatened species, including spreading seed onto new sites. And they've had some success with that, and as I mentioned, we are working with the Botanical Garden right now to try to propagate these things in a lab for eventual outplanting. That's only been done by 3 or 4 different people in the country at this point. So we got our fingers crossed that we can replicate their success.
The arboretum at the University of Minnesota is doing some propagation as well on the Calopogon. Question about timing of blooms. Well, you did mention about the fringed orchids and the bouquet and when they were blooming, and then the Spiranthes vernalis you mentioned could be blooming any day. There are some other, or at least one other Spiranthes that blooms in the fall. Is that correct? Can you speak about that and about the overall blooming?
Our other Spiranthes species are all fall bloomers, and I should have mentioned that. I'm sorry. They all bloom much later, usually beginning in August into September. So vernalis is the one that you'll see coming up now, and then the others will all come online in the fall. So there's still time to get out and enjoy them.
Thank you. What about some of the, well, I know I saw ragged fringed orchid blooming now on a prairie in Missouri, and the Oklahoma grass pink orchid blooming now. And then the western and eastern, are those blooming generally in June? Is that correct?
Yeah, so the eastern and western prairie fringed orchid, we generally say they bloom in the week of June 15th. I have since transferred to Columbia, so I haven't been up to check on our populations to know where they'll be this year. But generally mid-June is what we would say for those two species. The raggedy fringed orchid is usually a week or two earlier.
Thank you. Question about, you mentioned about how the sphinx moths and the hawk moths, in terms of the sphinx moths, has it been established how far they can fly during their lifetime?
Yeah, so sphinx moths undergo migrations, probably not quite at the scale of the monarch, but certainly close. We know that a lot of our populations of sphinx moths they don't overwinter in Missouri, so they're repopulated from the south every year. So we may get a species flying up from Texas and then laying eggs in Missouri, or perhaps even further. Several hundred miles is certainly within the realm of possibility.
Thank you. Also a question about the hawk moths. What prairie plants are their hosts? And the hawk moths that are important for orchid pollination, and which species of hawk moths pollinate the prairie orchids?
So Hyles lineatus, Sphinx erymetreus are a couple of the species that are known pollinators for these. And the hosts for a lot of those are mints, and they're not particularly choosy about the mints as far as we know. Monarda fistulosa, the wild bergamot, is a good host plant to plant for sphinx moths. The common one that we think of a lot of times when we think of hawk moths would be like the tomato hornworm or the tobacco hornworm, the ones we might see in our gardens. And these species don't have the right proboscis link, so they're not effective pollinators of this species. I believe there's a species that is a host plant on grapes, wild grapes, and Virginia creeper that is also an effective pollinator. We haven't gone down the route of trying to plant the host plant for these sphinx moths on the prairies yet, simply because they are widespread right now. So we don't necessarily think they're a limiting factor for the pollination of the orchids, but to be honest, we don't really know. Sphinx moth populations in the Northeast have really crashed from historical levels, and that's thought to be primarily due to the spraying for gypsy moths. We don't have serious infestations of gypsy moths in Missouri yet, so we haven't undergone wholesale eradication attempts. But on the other hand, there's not a lot of people doing long-term studies of moth populations in Missouri, so we really could be missing the boat on this. And that's another good one I'll throw out there for anybody that's interested. If you want to contribute to the science, start doing some sphinx moth population studies.
Thank you. So question, are you aware of orchids at Dunn Ranch Prairie? Although I will say, I actually, before I sort of retract that, I like to be careful about giving exact locations of where orchids are, because there can be, unfortunately, poaching going on. Maybe you could speak about orchid conservation in that realm, about I'm interested in your thoughts on kind of being careful about being very, careful about precise information. What's your take on that?
Sure. So first I'll say that there's a couple of Spiranthes orchids that occur at Dunn Ranch, but none of these other species occur there at the moment that we know of. So Carol's right, the orchids are very beautiful, and as such are highly desirable for home gardening. But we talked a lot about the intricate relationships they have with their environment. And, one consequence of that is that they simply don't transplant very well. They would need to be transplanted with a sufficient amount of their mycorrhizal fungus in order to provide them with the nutrients that they need to survive. And, that's probably something that's a huge amount of soil, probably cubic meters of soil, in order to fully encompass, enough mycorrhizal fungi to support the plant. And so there have been instances of people digging up prairie fringed orchids for home gardening, and they died that summer. And so not only is it bad for the population, I showed you how low most of our populations are. But the unfortunate thing too is not only are you taking from the wild population, but that plant is almost guaranteed to die. Leave these plants out in the prairie where they have the relationship that they need to survive, and they're also in a place where everybody can enjoy them.
Thank you, Steve. Question from Lance. Will you continue to be the lead for the Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid now that you've moved to the Central Division with the Conservation Department?
Yeah, Lance, we're currently working that out. I'll probably be involved this year, and then we'll transfer those duties. But I'll let you know when we're going up there.
Question, why don't you put cameras on to see what comes to the plants rather than catching them?
Well, when we were doing those hawk moth studies was kind of before, I think the technology has advanced to the point where people are doing that now. I know there's a study going on in, I believe it's Nebraska, looking at pollinators of Western prairie fringed orchid using some advanced techniques like that. Dave and I had talked about that, a decade ago. And unfortunately, at that stage, the technology was just not there. Most trail cams use an infrared sensor or use a heat-based sensor in order to trigger. And the hawk moths simply don't produce enough heat in order to trigger the sensor. And so your other option would be a motion-based trigger, and the orchids simply just move around too much. But again, I think we are probably to that stage now where the technology can capture that. And I think that work is going on, and we're probably right to implement it in Missouri as well.
Thank you. As a question from Sarah, using a term that I am not familiar with, so I'm going to ask you to explain it to us. She says, the grass pink orchid is non-resupinate. Most orchids are resupinate, and the buds rotate 180 degrees to bring the lip to the ventral position. Does this non-resupinate blossom not rotate at all, or do they rotate a complete 360 degrees?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to it. We'll have to get out there and watch. The calopogons are interesting because they look like they're upside down, but it's all because of those false stamens. That's a good thing to check out.
So what does resupinate mean? Is it refer to how the flower is oriented?
It mostly refers to being upside down, so that they flip the flowers over.
Thank you. I had a question looking at a variety of grass pink orchids that range from deep pink to light pink. Is the color variation simply genetic, or I had heard that with some flowers, maybe not orchids, but some flowers, after they're pollinated, the petal color can even change as an indicator that they've been pollinated, or is that not true?
Yeah, a lot of flowers will do that, particularly asters and Claytonia is another one, Spring Beauty. Will change to pink after they've been pollinated. It's a signal to the pollinator that are no longer offering rewards. I am not familiar with anybody looking at that in grass pink orchids. My gut feeling would be that it's related to just genetic variability. But again, another excellent question that's in need of further research.
Yes, there's always so much to learn. It's a question not about the prairie orchids, but about an orchid in southeastern Missouri. Do you know if there's been any research on the Plantathera ciliaris in southeastern Missouri?
I know the populations have been monitored over time, but beyond that, I really couldn't tell you. I'm sorry. I worked in Northwest Missouri for 11 years, so it was a very long drive to get down to Southeast and work on those.
The question, do companies sell mycorrhizal inocula for the few wild orchids that can be purchased?
So there is one company that is selling native mycorrhizal fungi that I'm aware of. I think it's called MycoBloom. It was developed over in Kansas based on isolates of native prairie fungus. And if one were to legally obtain commercially grown orchid seed, I would definitely recommend trying to use that myco bloom with the orchid seeds to increase your odds of success. I don't know offhand what species that mix contains, and if it's the right for orchids. You'd have to kind of look at the label and probably give them a call. The company is affiliated with a university, people in the lab there that studied mycorrhizal fungi for a long time and know a lot more about it than I do.
Thank you. The question, do you know any academic institutions in Missouri or surrounding states that are actively doing research on prairie orchids? And of course, yes, I guess from David Ashley.
Yeah, so I mean, Dave retired several years ago. So Missouri Western was doing most of the prairie orchid work that I'm aware of in the state. Since his retirement, we haven't developed any new strong relationships. A lot of times these studies tend to be hard to get funding for. You know, you're not going to get an NSF grant likely to study a lot of these things, especially unraveling natural history type questions. So the department does fund prairie orchid work on occasion, and anybody out there that's interested in looking at some of these questions further, I'd be happy to help you try to find some funding, but it can be hit or miss.
I don't see any other questions, but I do have a final question for you, Steve. What are some of the things that people can do to help conserve orchids on prairies or in any other habitat in Missouri or anywhere for that matter?
Right. So, with orchids, generally their relationships are so complex that number one thing you can do is to save the habitat. And I know, and kudos to Missouri Prairie Foundation for kind of leading the charge on that. Conserved more prairie in the last few years than anyone, and some great prairies from the sounds of it. So habitat conservation is number one. Saving these things even in the laboratory setting or at some place like Shaw is challenging. And until we unravel a lot of those relationships, habitat conservation is going to be the best way to go. And also keep in mind that when you're conserving the habitat, you're conserving all those relationships, including the pollinator populations that these orchids also rely upon.
Well, thank you, Steve. I don't see any other questions. Everyone, as Erica mentioned, Steve's presentation was recorded. It will be available on YouTube, so you can rewatch it. And Erica will get a link to the recording out to everyone as soon as she can, along with any resources, Steve, that you might have that you'd like to share with us, links to more information that we can share with registrants. So Absolutely. Thank you very much, Steve, for your time and your excellent presentation. And thanks everyone for tuning in. We have another prairie webinar coming up in 2 weeks about conservation efforts on the Regal fritillary. And Steve will be back with us because he is not only knowledgeable about orchids, but about Regal fritillary butterflies and so many other things. But we will have 3 panelists. Steve is one of them, and they're all discussing about really exciting and fascinating research to conserve the Regal fritillary butterfly, which is a real hallmark of our prairie. So you can register for that. Registration is open on our website, and we'll be very pleased to see Steve back in 2 weeks. So thanks again, Steve, and have a good evening, everyone.